Welcome to VMAP. So far, in our look at BDSM, we've considered what counterintuitive needs are. And last week, we looked at how endogenous opioids and cannabinoids may contribute to make us like pain, much like our runner's high. In this episode, we're going to focus on learning a complementary theory about some other drivers that may be behind counterintuitive needs, called opponent process.
If you haven't watched the previous episode, we suggest you jump back and take a look. This one may not make much sense without it. Also, why are you hitting yourself in the head with a hammer?
Duh. Because it feels so good when I stop.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Dahl.
And I'm James Gordon.
You're still hitting yourself in the head.
It still feels so good when I stop. In VMAP's series on BDSM and power exchange, we focus on the why of BDSM. You probably already know how to use a flogger, and if not, there are better resources online. We want to investigate the many divergent needs that drive an interest in BDSM, or what we've termed counterintuitive needs. That is to say, the desire for things like pain, control, or confinement that logic suggests we'd want to avoid.
The goal is to understand the way these needs shape the desire for control and power exchange, so that we can build better relationships. We know that with luck, power exchange can succeed without that knowledge, but when it fails explosively, that's often because one partner didn't understand the core needs of the other partner.
In our last episode, we looked at flying on endogenous opioids, including endorphins. We're going to hazard a guess that's the best known reason people might embrace for pain. But it doesn't explain everything, and for some people, particularly those who are interested in confinement, humiliation, or control, it doesn't explain much at all.
In this episode, we're going to take a look at a much less well-known and more mysterious neurochemical phenomenon called opponent process. In terms of human addiction to pain and other counterintuitive desires, it's a fairly new psychological concept, and most people haven't ever heard of it, let alone understand it. Though some psychologists believe it explains why we sometimes seek pain to soothe ourselves or feel better, not only in BDSM, but in some athletics and some types of non-suicidal self-harm.
In our next 3 episodes, we'll look at more purely psychological concepts, including control and proof of safety, identity, and trauma, including re-experiencing and familiarity.
It's an old joke, but most jokes expose some glimmer of truth. In this case, a big glimmer. Opponent process is a neurochemical theory that was originally developed to explain how vision works. It's one of those things that sounds more complicated than it is, so we'll try a simple example.
Keelan is your typical femme, wearing combat boots, a schoolgirl skirt, and black t-shirt. Keelan leaves their local BDSM club, which, like most clubs, is in an urban area that's mostly businesses and warehouses, and has little daytime traffic and no traffic at night. Keelan has to turn down a dark alley to walk to their car.
Suddenly, Keelan realizes there's a zombie behind them. In fact, its horrible undead hand is about to tear Keelan limb from limb.
Then Keelan realizes that it's their friend Robin, not a zombie after all. Zombies don't exist.
Or do they? This is Keelan's brain after seeing the zombie. See how it's sending out neurochemical signals to increase their heart rate and respiration, and to constrict blood flow to their extremities, to make it harder for you to bleed out if you're injured or maimed by a zombie. It's preparing for fight or flight.
Now, this is Keelan's brain after realizing it's Robin. Why doesn't Keelan stay in a fight or flight state forever? Why doesn't Keelan stay scared not just for minutes, but for hours, till all the chemicals have burned out of their system? Well, we've turned these chemicals on, so we have to assume there's a way to turn them off.
We don't know how exactly, but opponent process theory suggests that another set of chemical reactions occur, actually working against and canceling out the initial chemical signals. This explains why human and other mammals can change emotions fairly quickly and fluidly.
One way to think of opponent process is to imagine a car that coasts downhill till it stops. Opponent process would be a brake, actively slowing the car down by applying direct force to the wheel.
Opponent process was originally formulated in the 19th century to explain how vision works, and so far it's easy enough to understand, but it has some strange properties that may explain some complex human behavior.
Let's say that Indigo is a female-bodied and identifying person who's just discovered a lump on her breast. She feels it repeatedly, granular beneath her fingertips. It feels like the Matterhorn has taken root on her breast. Her aunt died of breast cancer, and at first she's paralyzed with fear, sitting on the floor and crying. Eventually, she pulls out her cell phone and calls her doctor. Surprisingly, they have an appointment that very afternoon.
She calls into work and spends the morning pacing, trying to distract herself. By the time she reaches the waiting room at 2 p.m., she's still very tense and disturbed, but no longer distracted and terrified. The nurse, a large, reassuring person whose name tag says Richard, can see she has all the signs associated with intense anxiety and offers to get her a cup of tea from the break room. She's clearly unhappy.
The doctor takes a quick look and tells her that she has a sebaceous cyst, and while he takes a sample just to make sure, schedules her for a laser punch procedure the next week at his practice outpatient clinic, a procedure that'll be relatively painless and takes about an hour.
Taking the rest of the day off, she goes shopping at Target, buys some clothes she didn't really need, and smiles cheerfully at the store clerk. Later, she calls a friend and they make an impromptu weeknight sortie to Buffalo Wild Wings, where she orders a couple of drinks and tips the server extra. She seems joyful, which is not really her normal character.
By the next day, she's back to her practical self, hanging up the clothes she bought with a shake of the head and heading to the office, where she greets colleagues in a perfunctory way. She's back to being herself.
Let's look at a graph of Indigo's day. Here we see her crying on the floor, and here we see her leveling into distraction and pacing. Here we see her plunge into euphoria, and here leveling off as she heads to Buffalo Wild Wings. By the next morning, she's back here. We're going to call this State A and this State B.
Now, let's drop in on Lake and Sydney. They're lying in bed, and Lake has just dropped their hand to stroke Sydney's thigh, eliciting a moan of pleasure. Lake's lips close over Sydney's nipple, and they suck for a few moments. Sydney at first becomes more aroused, then levels off, breathing steadying. At this point, Lake would usually drop their hand between Sydney's legs, raising the level of arousal once again.
Unfortunately, Lake works a tech support job that has them on call on alternate weekends, and at that moment the cell phone goes off with the distinctive trumpet and melody ringtone of "They Might Be Giants, I Never Go to Work." Lake swears, rolls over, and pads naked into the home office to take a call.
Sydney's pleasure drops like a stone, and they lay alone in bed for a while, the warmth of Lake's skin fading, hoping for a quick call. As it becomes clear this is going to take a while, Sydney becomes tense and irritated, still strongly craving Lake's touch and a resumption of their intimacy.
Minutes slide by and Lake does not return. Sydney pulls up a cell phone and gets lost in Candy Crush Saga. The sexuality and irritation have both faded, and Sydney's state is sort of dispassionate normality.
You see how the graph for Lake and Sydney was pretty much the same. A sharp peak leveling off, the plunge, and a slow recovery. That makes sense. BDSM tops who do flogging or other play, as well as most lovers who've engaged in conventional foreplay and afterplay, will recognize this pattern, especially the part above the line. You've seen the flash of excitement and the slow dropping off that tells you it's time to go to the next level.
Now, here's something that at first seems to make no sense at all.
In the late 1970s, Harvard psychologist Richard Solomon was looking at some research that had been done on shocking dogs about a decade earlier in the 60s.
He wanted to explain a strange thing. When the dogs were first shocked, they'd been terrified, and afterwards shown signs of stress.
Now, we might expect that when shocked again, the dogs would end up even more stressed, until the promise of daily shocks left them catatonic and unresponsive. Or maybe since the shocks weren't all that dangerous and painful, they'd just end up blasé, happy to get their daily shocking over with and go home to watch the then popular Gilligan's Island and drown their troubles in Purina and Falstaff beer.
Instead, when they were shocked again, they seemed increasingly less terrified at the shocks and positively joyful when they were over, running around, licking researchers' faces, and wagging their tails.
Solomon teamed up with researcher John D. Corbett from his alma mater of Brown University to explain this. They looked at work by Dr. Seymour Epstein, who'd done research on skydiving.
Epstein found the same pattern. Novice skydivers were starkly terrified when they jumped and stony-faced and stunned when they landed, probably because they were jumping out of a plane. More experienced skydivers were a lot less scared to start with, though they might be tense and anxious. Again, probably because they're jumping out of a plane. When they landed, though, they were exuberant, exhilarated, and felt good. They loved to jump because this feeling could last for hours.
Darkly, Solomon found examples of the opposite response with opiate users. They needed more and more of the drug to get a rush, and had stronger and uglier withdrawal symptoms.
Note that in both cases, the pattern of A and B is followed, but the pattern goes from this
to this, with A very muted, but B longer and more pronounced.
They thought that this could be explained by an underlying dynamic like this, where an opponent process started powerfully and kept going every time it was stimulated, while the response to the initial stimulus got weaker.
It might seem this wouldn't make sense. Shouldn't the opponent response be about the same, a measured reaction to the stimulus? Solomon and Corbett thought not. The opponent process was designed in simplest terms to bring the body back into whack after a jolt, but responses need to be adaptive so that we don't constantly overreact to the same stimulus.
They thought a process designed to keep the body in a normal state might work more like the body's immune process, which actually gets more powerful when it's stimulated more often. That would explain the curve and explain a great deal about addiction, withdrawal, and emotions.
From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. For primitive humans or mammals, it would be useful to overreact and run away the first time, for example, you see a potentially dangerous animal. A strong reaction might just keep you alive. But if you've survived seeing it 3 or 4 times, it's probably adaptive to start warily eyeing it and casually sizing it up as a potential addition to your menu to alleviate the tedium of flea to mastodon.
In fact, if you've ever been involved in training humans to work around dangerous equipment or in dangerous situations, you know that one of the main risks is the tendency of humans to become very blasé about circumstances that many of us would find terrifying, to the point that they need routines and rules to keep them from forgetting basic safety precautions like using safety lines or wearing protective gear.
A side effect of this is that someone could get used to, say, pain or humiliation, or any other emotional negative, to the point where they got more pleasure and benefit out of the opponent process, the recovery period, than they did fear and harm out of the negative. There isn't even a firm universal agreement that opponent process exists. It's just the model that best fits how our emotions seem to work in real life, and it explains seeming contradictions in our behavior in a way that other more simplistic theories about emotional biochemistry don't.
This doesn't necessarily conflict with the idea of flying or endogenous opioids. Those seem to exist to buffer stresses in the body when it's under prolonged stress, which is the root of the flying experience.
Because it's a newer neurochemical theory, and more complicated than flying, opponent process wasn't incorporated into thought about BDSM until very recently.
For years, research on self-harm focused on chasing down psychological causes. It was a fad, it was an expression of rage, etc. However, researchers in the early 2000s found this might be the reason people started cutting, but it wasn't the reason they kept doing it. Many actual cutters reported that it had an addictive quality and cut as a way to self-soothe after something bad or upsetting.
So why might cutting be soothing? Researchers in 2010 began to suspect it might have to do with the opponent process. If the amount of pain was fairly small, and you got used to it, the opponent process might provide a positive feeling that outweighed the negative. Might be a way of bringing the body back into normalcy. Other scientists had already hit on the suggestion of a neurochemical angle, suggesting that self-harm might be a way to spur the production of chemicals, which were in short supply in some individuals, particularly serotonin.
Now researchers are asking the same questions about BDSM. It has many of the same psychological elements of self-harm, and those who crave things like bondage, pain, or emotional hurt often describe it as a need or an addiction. Why would this make any sense? Well, because opponent process says that a hurt, particularly one you can ritualize, minimize, or tolerate, can spur a fairly consistent positive response that isn't entirely dependent on the intensity of the hurt. So really it's true. The reason to hit yourself with a hammer is because it feels so good when it stops. And there's solid scientific reasoning and data to back this up.
We speculate that the opponent process probably varies from individual to individual, but particularly with intense scenes, emotional edge play, etc., may act like an addict's withdrawal or a skydiver's high, lasting for hours or days afterwards.
The process may not always be as direct and pronounced as it is with skydiving, but that doesn't mean it isn't pervasive and real, and may explain overall feelings that BDSM is somehow beneficial, and even explain findings that BDSM practitioners may have slightly better mental health than average.
In relationship to endogenous opioids, opponent process may cause scene crash, where individuals who do experience a very strong or pleasurable rush during BDSM activities may find themselves crashing afterward.
In terms of power exchange, a motivation may be finding a partner who is willing to do the things that push us to the point of engaging the opponent process reliably. This week on VMAP, we learned about opponent process. Opponent process suggests that when one set of chemicals triggers an emotion, our body prepares a second set of chemicals that damp the reaction as soon as the thing stimulating us stops.
We observed how this applies to both positive and negative feelings.
We observe that because they may have different drivers, the initial emotion may get weaker, while the opponent emotion may become more powerful, and looked at a graph that makes it easier to understand how this seeming contradiction can occur.
We talked about studies that suggested that the reason people persist at self-harm may be to calm emotions and self-soothe. This suggests that getting pain from others, emotionally or physically, could have a similar function. For VMAP, I'm James Gordon.
And I'm Rebecca Dahl.
Remember, there's no right way to do power exchange.
Only your way. I blame insanity, because the plane's perfectly good. You stay in the plane.
Doesn't that sound fun?
No.